If you have stood on the deck of a British warship in the early morning hours of September 14, 1814, you might have seen something peculiar through the smoke of battle. Not just a battered fort, not merely a flag, but a thin, anxious man squinting into the dawn as though he expected heaven itself to deliver him an answer. And in a manner of speaking, it did. For that anxious man was Francis Scott Key, and the answer came stitched in stripes and stars. But before that flag ever waved triumphantly over Baltimore harbor, before it was sung in schoolhouses and shouted in stadiums, it was born of cannon smoke, diplomatic errands, and a nation still unsure whether it meant to survive. The year was 1814. The United States was barely 3 decades old, and like most children of that age, it possessed confidence disproportionate to its experience. The War of 1812 was underway, a conflict born of grievances against Great Britain, impressment of American sailors, interference with trade, and a certain lingering irritation that the former mother country had not yet quite accepted that of her child. Washington City had already suffered the indignity of being burned in August of 1814. The Capitol and the President's house smoldered in blackened heaps. Americans were wounded not just in body but in pride, and Britain, having recently concluded its exhausting war with Napoleon in Europe, could now afford to turn its full attention to this rebellious offspring across the Atlantic. Baltimore was next. Now, Francis Scott Key was not a soldier. He was not a sailor. He was not, in fact, particularly fond of war at all. Born in 1779 in Maryland, Key had been raised in comfort and education. He became a lawyer, and by most accounts, a conscientious one. He was deeply religious, thoughtful, and given more to contemplation than cannon fire. He opposed war in principle, though he supported his country in practice. In September of 1814, Key was asked to undertake a delicate mission. A respected American physician, Dr. William Beanes, had been captured by the British after the burning of Washington. Friends and officials hoped Key, with his legal standing and calm temperament, might negotiate the doctor's release, and so he boarded a truce vessel under a flag of negotiation. Key met with British officers aboard their fleet in the Chesapeake Bay. Among them was Admiral Alexander Cochrane and Major General Robert Ross. By all accounts, Key made his case well. The British agreed to release Dr. Beanes. But there was a complication, and history often thrives on complications. Key and his companions had overheard too much. They had learned of the British plan to attack Baltimore, and for that reason, though the doctor was freed, Key and his party were detained temporarily aboard a British vessel until after the coming assault. And so it was that Francis Scott Key found himself unwillingly stationed within the sight of Fort McHenry, at precisely the moment it would endure one of the fiercest bombardments in American history. On the morning of September 13, 1814, British ships began their assault on Fort McHenry, which guarded the Baltimore harbor. The British possessed formidable firepower. Their bomb ships launched explosive shells that arced high into the air before crashing down upon the fort. Rockets streaked across the sky in fiery trails. For 25 hours, 25 long, sleepless, ear-splitting hours, the bombardment continued. Imagine the scene. Thunder not from clouds but cannon. Lightning not from heaven but from gunpowder. Smoke clung to the water like a dirty blanket. The air stank of salt and sulfur. From his position aboard the British vessel, Key could see little through the haze, but he could see enough. He could see the American flag flying above the fort, and then he could not. As darkness fell, the smoke thickened and the rain began. The British rockets and shells illuminated the sky in flashes, giving momentary glimpses of the fort's silhouette. He watched each burst with a terrible anticipation. Was the fort still holding? Was the flag still there? There is something uniquely human about watching for a flag. It is cloth, after all, merely fabric. Yet it carries the weight of hope, identity, and defiance. If the flag fell, it would signal surrender. And if Fort McHenry surrendered, Baltimore might fall. And if Baltimore fell, well, a young nation might falter in spirit, if not in fact. Key did not sleep that night. Few men in his position would have. As the bombardment ceased in the pre-dawn hours of September 14th, an uneasy silence settled over the harbor. The British had hurled between 1,500 and 1,800 shells and rockets at the fort, and now there was quiet. It is in such quiet moments that the heart beats loudest. When the smoke began to lift with the coming morning light, Key strained his eyes towards Fort McHenry. At first he could see nothing very clearly. Then, gradually, as the sun climbed and the haze thinned, a shape emerged. A great garrison flag measuring approximately 30 by 42 feet, sewn by Mary Pickersgill and her assistants in Baltimore. And there it was, still flying, still defiant, still American. One can imagine Key's breath catching in his throat, that peculiar mixture of relief and awe that follows long dread. Baltimore had not fallen. The fort had held, and the flag remained. Moved beyond restraint, Key began composing lines of verse on the back of a letter he carried in his pocket. He later completed the poem at a Baltimore hotel. The title he first gave it was Defense of Fort McHenry. Its opening question was not rhetorical but deeply sincere. "Oh, say, can you see, by the dawn's early light?" He wrote of rockets, red glare, and bombs bursting in air, images drawn directly from the night he had just endured. The poem captured not merely a military success, but a national sigh of relief. It was printed in the newspaper within days, and then something curious happened. The words were soon set to the melody of an English song, "To Anacreon in Heaven," composed by John Stafford Smith for a London gentleman's club. Now, if that strikes you as odd that America's anthem should ride upon an English tune, you are not alone. History is fond of such ironies. But the melody was popular and well known at the time, making the poem easier to sing and spread it did. It became known as the Star-Spangled Banner, and for over a century it lived as a patriotic song, sung at public events and military ceremonies. But it was not yet the national anthem. That came much later. Throughout the 19th century, America sang many patriotic songs, "Hail Columbia" and "My Country 'Tis of Thee." They were prominent among them. The Star-Spangled Banner gradually gained favor, particularly within the military. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson ordered that it be played at military and official occasions. Finally, in 1931, more than a century after Key penned his verses, Congress passed a resolution designating it as the national anthem of the United States. President Herbert Hoover signed it into law. Thus, what began as one man's anxious vigil became the voice of a nation. As for the very flag that flew over Fort McHenry, it survived. It was preserved by the Armistead family and eventually donated to the Smithsonian Institution. Time, light, and souvenir-seeking visitors took their toll upon it. Portions were clipped away over the years before preservation practices improved. But it remains today carefully conserved, a tangible remnant of that smoke-filled morning. The cloth is faded now, the red subdued and the white softened with age. But its meaning has not dimmed. Francis Scott Key continued his career as a lawyer. He served as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, and he lived until 1843. Yet, on that September morning in 1814, he bore witness to something larger than himself. He gave language to a nation's endurance, and history remembers him most vividly for that. It is easy in our present day to grow accustomed to symbols. We see the flag often, we hear the anthem before games, we stand perhaps by habit more than reflection. But on that night in 1814, there was nothing habitual about it. The outcome was uncertain. The survival of the city was uncertain. The strength of a young republic was uncertain. And in that uncertainty, a question rose at dawn. Does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave? It was not merely about cloth. It was about whether an experiment in liberty would continue. So next time when you hear those opening notes, high and challenging, climbing like a question into the sky, remember the scene. A harbor cloaked in smoke. A sleepless lawyer peering into the gray, a fort battered but unbowed, and a flag improbably, stubbornly still there. History is not always written in ink, but sometimes it is written in fire across the sky. And sometimes, if you are fortunate enough to witness it, you find yourself holding the words. If you enjoyed this deep dive into American history told in story form, consider subscribing for more narratives where we peel back the smoke of time and see what still waves in the dawn's early light.